complicated. We'll put it that way. So today we're going to go over SPOs. SPOs are, the term SPO is an internal verbiage, right? It basically just stands for standing purchase order. You may have heard service purchase order. It kind of doesn't matter what you call it. The function of an SPO is basically a purchase order that's open for an extended period of time that is basically going to be invoiced against multiple times, and could potentially track contract spend, basically a supplier relationship with the property. Like, there's lots of reasons to have an SPO, but that's basically what an SPO is, right? It's a document in Coupa that facilitates a lot of different things. That's an incredibly simple definition of what an SPO is. And the reason we went over SPOs a little bit during our buyer training back in December, but you guys learned so much stuff that it's really important, I think, that we kind of go over this. Today, we are going to be talking a lot about SPOs conceptually, right? Because there's so many different ways to issue an SPO. There's so many different reasons that you would change the format of an SPO. It's really important for us to really understand why SPOs work a certain way and make sure we're formatting them correctly, right? Making sure that the SPO is functioning the way it should. Because I will say, issuing an SPO is just one very small part of the process. So I created a little PowerPoint for us today. And I'm going to share it with you guys, obviously, in this call, so you can always refer back to it. I'm also going to put it on the team site, so in case you want to refer back to it later, you can. This is very high level information, and it's basically just explaining, like, when we're building an SPO, when we get an SPO request, when we think an SPO is the right methodology to use in Coupa, what information should we know? What information do we have to know to build the SPO correctly? And what are the steps and what are some of the pieces of building an SPO that are just not getting a PO number, right? Because getting a PO number is relatively easy, okay? So what parts are involved in building an SPO? So first, let's talk about this. There's actually several parts in building an SPO. First, it's our end user understanding and participation. A lot of our end users, a lot of our SPOs are for non-tangible services, are for software billings or PM agreements or leases or taxes or utilities, things where there is not a tangible exchange of goods at a singular point. So who receives those? Who manages those? That's our end users. That's our stakeholders. They have to understand their participation. They have to understand what the SPO is for, how it's being used, and what their responsibility is once an SPO is issued, right? It's not just put in a rec and I'll take care of it. It's, hey, you're going to put in a rec, we're going to work together on the format, and then once the PO is issued, you have to receive it, right? You have to audit those invoices. You have to be paying attention to what's going on. If you need more money, you have to request it. All of those things are part of end user participation. The second thing, backing document. So as we all know, with every free text, Coupa asks us for a backing document. What is a backing document? Well, if it's applicable, it's a contract or a pricing agreement, okay? And those are things we load in Coupa in the contract module. And those provide an auditable, right? An auditable chain from your purchase order to the document that governs your purchase order. What is the price? What is the frequency? How much should they charge me? When should they charge me? When should I pay it? All of those things relate to your purchase order and are linked through the backing document. Bid requirements, separate from a backing document, guys. Backing documents is the actual contractor pricing agreement that governs your purchase order, right? The pricing, the frequency, the services, what's included, what's not included. A bid requirement is something totally different. Does this meet bid requirements, right? Do we have to bid this out? If we don't, that's fine. If we do, did we? Should we? Can we? All of those things are things you have to ask yourself about the SPO, okay? Now, the next thing is formatting the SPO during buyer action. So your end user can format it, you can format it. The important part is formatting the SPO is crucial to the success of the SPO, right? Because this is supposed to govern multiple invoices over a long period of time. Make sure that it's formatted correctly, that it's tracking correctly, that it can be invoiced against multiple times, that if it should audit a price, it does audit a price. All of those things kind of play into how the document should be formatted. It is not as simple as cutting a purchase order for a large chunk of money and calling it a day. Okay, that is a very simplistic way to look at an SPO. Do some of them end up that way? Yes, because there is no other way to tie all of this stuff together. Should they all be that way? No. Okay, so if all of your SPOs are just bulk dollars, maybe take a step back and look at a better way to format them. The last one is supplier involvement and their understanding of the SPO, right? Do they know that this is going to be their PO for the length of their contract? Do they know they can invoice against it multiple times? How should they invoice against it multiple times? Is there a line per month? Is it a bulk dollar? Is it outlining the costs? So they need to know what lines to bill against. Maybe they're providing you labor and some of it's for banquets and some of it's for main kitchen. How do they know? How do they know what to bill against? All of those things are necessary for an SPO. These are all of the pieces that tie into a standing purchase order. So all of these pieces, the SPO ties all of these pieces together. Okay, so that's what parts are involved. What do you need to know about when you're processing an SPO as a buyer? As a buyer, you need to know, is there a contract? Is there a pricing agreement? Should this be bid? Can it be bid? Was it bid? So all of the notice, right? All of these questions. So this is why this is definitely more of a conceptual call for us today, because there's no way I could give you every possible example of everything that we're talking about right now. But these are the things you need to know: contracts, bids, how the service or item is ordered, how it's received, how we verify it, like who does that, when do they do it, how do they do it, right? Those are really important things to understand. How's it invoiced? How many GL codes do we need to use? How many different departments are involved? All of these things they play into how an SPO is formatted. Even to the point that sometimes you're going to be doing this research and you realize, this probably shouldn't be an SPO. This should probably be a catalog. Okay, because I've had end users ask me, can't we just cut an SPO for this vendor managed inventory? And I'm like, we can, but don't you approve what the vendor brings? Like, they don't just get carte blanche to bring whatever they want. So you're in the process already. So that's not necessarily always the standard, as they bring whatever they want. How does the doc know what the approved order looks like if it's just a big standing purchase order, right? There's different questions you have to ask based on these questions, so you can determine the best way to build an SPO. Okay, so we go into why do we need to know these things. Okay, so it's really important to understand, is there a contract or pricing agreement? If there is, the SPO needs to reflect the length of the agreement as well as the details of the agreement. So if your contract is 3 years long, your SPO should be for 3 years. Okay. The only time you will be entering an SPO that is calendar year specific is when there is not a contract or pricing agreement. Okay. Really important to understand that. Utilities is a great example, right? We usually don't have a contractor pricing agreement. It fluctuates regularly. That is a great example of something that we would issue January to December. Okay. I will also say slot leases is also another one where there is a contract, multiple, in fact, for every property, but those contracts are changing all the time. They're evergreen contracts, meaning that they are month to month and they just extend to infinity and beyond. So in order for us to efficiently manage all of those, it's an annual SPO. If your SPO is governed by a contract with a different timeline, 36 months, 50 months, 60 months, 6 months, your SPO should reflect the contract timeline. If your contract auto renews, great. Put a reminder on the contract. At 5 months, your end user and you should collaborate again to get an SPO for that auto renewal. Okay. So that is why it's really important to know if there's a contract or pricing agreement. The next thing is, if there is a contract and pricing agreement, can the SPO help audit those prices? Can the SPO help keep track of how many services are being completed if the services are the same price? How many times we're calling the supplier if we're always paying the same cost for a trip fee, right? If the SPO can do that, then that is what we should use the SPO for. Yes, it can get a little more complicated, but at the end of the day, the data is worth it because it helps all of us send these items back out for bid. It helps us understand the relationship. It helps us understand the services we're getting and what they're costing us. And the more information we have, the better supply chain people we can be. So keep in mind, though, if this contractor pricing agreement is tangible goods that are not vendor managed, they cross the dock, you should consider a catalog, not an SPO. If it's a contract and pricing agreement, it's nationally managed, such as Cintas, Nalco. There's a few out there that I can't think of. Slot leases are nationally managed. There is a best practice that has been published. Please, please, please double check best practices. Use them. They are best practices for a reason. Okay. So why do we need to know? Does the SPO meet bid requirements? Well, because we all have internal controls and we all have processes in place and we all have bid requirements. So if your SPO falls into the area of a bid requirement, your SPO must contain the bid information. Was this bid out? When was it bid out? Why was it awarded? Right? If it wasn't bid out, why not? And all of that information should be recorded in the scope and justification field so that it can be audited, so that it can be tracked. Just because you have a backing document does not mean you have this information. This information has to be included, right? The SPO is the document that ties all of this information together. Okay. Why do we need to know how it's ordered? Well, how does your vendor know what to bring you and when and how often and how much? All of those things are really important. And SPOs are not blankets, remember? We can't just do individual releases off of an SPO. That information has to be communicated to the supplier somewhere. So it's important to know how that communication is happening, right? How is it ordered? How does the vendor know what to send? How does the vendor know what to bring? When does the vendor bring stuff? Who checks it in? Is it the doc? Because if it's the doc, we have to give them a document to be able to check that in off of. It can't just be this like, oh, just trust the supplier, it's okay, accept whatever they bring. Not really a best practice, okay? So just keep that in mind. Who's doing the work, how it's happening. Maybe you have to change how it's happening today. Maybe that's something that we need to talk about with our stakeholders and say, you know what, I know the guy normally comes on Monday. You guys have a verbal conversation and then, the doc just trusts him. Maybe that's not the best practice, right? As we move to more centralized processes within Coupa, it's really hard to rely on processes that deal with in-person conversations, things that are not documented, or require that that knowledge of the process, right? If I'm going to step in and help another property, how am I ever going to know? I'm not going to have that property tribal knowledge, right? It has to be documented somewhere and in a relatively consistent way. So how is it invoiced? That's also really important, which I know is a little crazy. And when I was first learning how to build SPOs, this tripped me up. I can't tell you how many times. If you don't know, pull an old invoice. Ask the supplier to get you a sample invoice. Ask them how they're going to be invoicing you. It's really important to understand what unit of measure they're going to use. Is it a catch weight or not? Is it not a catch weight? How many invoices do they submit a month? Right? Those are all really critical things because it helps us format the SPO better. Okay. I'm going to stop here and show you guys kind of just a methodology behind that. So the reason it's important to understand why it's invoiced, how it's invoiced, right? We all know unit of measure, big deal. Okay. How they price something, big deal, right? That leads us to understanding how catalogs are set up, what the pricing should be on the PO, how many times it should be listed, those kind of things. The most important part is, if I am going to be building an SPO, when do I pick quantity and amount? One of the biggest things that affects this particular selection piece is how many invoices we are going to get. Okay, so let's say I know for a fact that I use a print supplier, and oops, you don't want to create a vendor. I use a print supplier, right? This is what I do. I know that we spend about $6,000 a month with them every month, okay? And I know my contract is 12 months long. I have 12 months more on my contract, okay? So this is how I'm going to format it. I've asked a couple questions. I totally understand what's going on. I'm going to add it to my cart. My buyer's going to process it. It's going to look just like this, except wait, because this $6,000, let's say I do spend $6,000 a month, but they invoice me weekly. That means I am going to have 4 to 5 invoices a month for varying dollars, not 12. So if the invoice is submitted, one each for $500, one each for $500, one each for $500 every week, to get me to that monthly amount that I think I'm going to spend, I'm going to use this quantity up a lot faster than I'm going to use the dollar up. And Coupa always looks at the quantity first. Okay. So if I have 12 invoices, they could equal a total of $6,000. And then what happens with the 7th invoice? Well, I'm going to be able to enter it. The vendor's going to be able to enter it through the CSP. Symbio is going to be able to put it in the system. But because there's not enough quantity here, it's going to go into pending receipt. And your end user, even though they go to the PO, there's nothing else to receive. You may not have used the dollars up, but you've used the quantity. So it's important. That's one of the most important reasons to understand how you are going to be invoiced, is because of this selection. FYI, you cannot change this once it's a purchase order. This has to be done on the requisition, either by your end user entering it or you during buyer action. It cannot be changed on the PO. You can update quantities on POs, you can update costs on POs, you cannot change it from a quantity to an amount. So just keep that in mind. That's why it's really important to know up front. So golden rule, 1 PO per invoice. So if, as an example, if you have 3 departments that buy from one supplier and it's all included on one contract, and you used to have 3 different people issuing BRs in Stratton Warren, this is going to require some work. We're going to have to decide who's going to own this, who's going to verify this moving forward. It should be on one purchase order because your supplier invoices it all on one invoice. We can do a couple of things here. We can get with the supplier and say, hey, can you separate these out and invoice me 3 times? We can get the supplier to e-invoice. And then they would have to separate it out. Or we can internally get one person to manage it and issue one purchase order to meet the one invoice requirement. So just keep that in mind. That's kind of a golden rule when you're creating POs, is how is it invoiced, and make sure that we're cutting the PO correctly. That's kind of a lot of the big information, what we need to know, why we need to know it. I will say that sometimes when you guys are doing this research, when you're asking these questions, when you're finding out the specifics of all of these pieces so we can create that SPO that manages this for us, sometimes we can't meet all of the existing criteria. It happens, okay? Sometimes we can't issue 15 POs for 15 different people to manage at 47 GL codes, right? Sometimes it doesn't work. The system can't make that work, at least not easily. And the less exceptions we make to these standards, the better off we're going to be as a company. But what do we do if we can't do this? Do we just process it in non-PO forever? Probably not a best practice. Partner with your end users, partner with your stakeholders, find a better way. Like, go through all the different scenarios on which it can work and find something that everyone's happy with. Yes, it's change. Yes, it takes work. At the end of the day, it's worth it. The reason being is because, like we talked about at the beginning, we're issuing SPOs for the length of the agreement. So these SPOs are going to be active for years, potentially. If you set up the SPO correctly, and you work with your end user so they know what's going on, and you know what's going on, and your supplier knows what's going on, and everybody's on the same page, it works flawlessly, right? The invoices get submitted right, they get received in a timely manner, they get paid, they get addressed, everyone's happy. It works really well. If one of those pieces is missing, if your end user doesn't know to receive, if we don't know how it's verified, if we don't know how it's invoiced, if your supplier gets a PO and doesn't know what to do with it, if one of those pieces isn't taken care of, then it fails consistently and constantly and for a long time, right? And it takes a lot more work to fix it than it does at the beginning. So the more work we put in up front, the better and smoother all of that works after. Okay. So I did put together a little like now that we know sheet, because it does talk about the specifics of why we're doing this, why it's linked. Is the SPO formatted so that certain things happen? Does the supplier know things? So this sheet is kind of like, after you gather all the information, here's all the pieces that we need to put into building the right PO structure. Okay. And then at the end here, I did give some best practices. So the slot and table leases. So I will say this took a long time for us to get here. This should be a monthly fee. You can see it listed here. This is in our buyer training deck. This is now here. I will say this is a best practice. Please follow it. There are properties out there that are not following it today. I really need you to. Here's a best practice for Cintas. So this is this is how Cintas has been set up. This is how Cintas understands the billing process. If you have questions about this, please reach out. This should cover the length of the agreement, guys. Our Cintas contract goes out to 2023. So just keep that in mind. Like, it doesn't matter if it's a 6-month agreement or a 36-month agreement. The SPO should reflect the length of the contract. This is a best practice for Cintas POs. We have a best practice for our contract back, where there is a set monthly fee and one invoice per month. This is what it should look like. Okay. Again, doesn't matter how long the agreement is, the PO should cover the length of the agreement. We also have a best practice for a set fee where we are not entirely sure of the frequency of that fee. The example here is labor. So we're using a third-party staffing company. We're not really sure how many hours we're going to use, but we know what they should charge us per hour. So this is how a PO should be built. It's an estimated hourly amount. We think we're going to use X. Our contract goes to 2022. right? And we now are using this document because of this hourly rate to audit the rate that the vendor is charging us, so that if they happen to charge us something different, it's going to flag and go to variance. If this was a bulk PO, I would have to manually, someone would have to manually do that. If you can use the PO to audit certain pricing, do it. It's going to save you a lot of time. It's going to catch a lot of things. Okay. So here's some best practices. That is kind of the basics of SPOs, what information you need, why you need the information. Obviously, applying it with all of those combinations is almost impossible to go through all of those scenarios. We are going to do a follow-up to this training with some more specific examples, but this should be a good start for you guys as you guys are creating more SPOs, reviewing SPOs. Later this year, when we're reviewing more SPOs for creation for 2022, this will be a really important place for all of us to go and use these principles and lessons when we're creating SPOs and working with our stakeholders.